Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a Senior Power Platform Specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Welcome everyone to this week's Friday Learning session. As by way of introduction, my name is Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I have been a Power Platform senior developer for around about 4 years now. I currently work at a consultancy called Vantage 365, working on multiple different projects. So I'm here today to essentially teach you a bit about Power Automate. So the name of the session is Power Automate in the Chamber of Secrets, and that's purely because Power Automate actually hides a lot of stuff for us, and we're gonna look into how it hides things and how we can get access to them. So we do have a bit of an agenda today. So we have our introduction. That's what we're doing here. Nice to see you all. We're going to be covering what I mean and what it is that Power Automate hides. So that's our what does Power Automate hide. So I'm going to show you how it hides things, what it hides, and then we're going to move on to how well it hides it there. How do we gain access to it? If we can't access it through a dynamic content menu, how do we get to it? And then we're going to look at some of the kind of common bits of hidden content out there that are going to be really useful. So we're going to specifically look at the Dataverse connector, the SharePoint connectors, and the approvals connector, because there's quite a lot of hidden content in the approvals connector that can be really, really useful. And then, as always, we'll have our section at the end for our discussion. So before we start any of that, our usual rules of engagement. So I'm a firm believer that there is no such thing as a stupid question. Um, and I have a 4-year-old daughter. Feel free to test that assumption. She does every day. We haven't found a stupid question that we couldn't find the answer to yet. So during the course of the session, if you want to ask a question, feel free to drop it in the chat. Or if you feel it can wait until the discussion section at the end, feel free to take it and bring it in there, where we'll have the option to speak on the stage and kind of have that verbal conversation and discussion there. That being said, let's get into the actual session itself. So, first things first, what does Power Automate hide? Well, the first question is, well, what do we usually do? What does Power Automate normally provide us, right? It provides us a dynamic content menu, and we normally access dynamic content. So these are things that change or outputs from steps. They're accessed from this dynamic content menu. So the first question we ask is, what does Power Automate actually give us to understand what it hides? And what it gives us is the items in that dynamic content menu, and that's how we normally access those things that change in the outputs of our actions. But have you ever actually looked at the raw outputs of a Power Automate action? A lot of the time we select from our flow the kind of content based upon that dynamic content menu, and we don't see what's actually there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just quickly move over to a flow that I have pre-prepared. So you can see here, I've got a few actions. I've got a Dataverse list rows action, a SharePoint get items action, and a start and wait for an approval action. What we're going to do is we're going to run this just based on a little bit of data that we've already got pre-prepared, and we're going to see what we get in our dynamic content menu output from these actions versus what we see in terms of the actual raw outputs. So you can see here, I have a compose box down here. Now, if we look at the dynamic content menu, you can see here that we have a few little bits, things like response summary, completion date, outcome, approval ID, titles, a few other little bits in there, right? And then we've got responses. And then when we get into the SharePoint stuff, we've got the list of items, the category, the ID, bits of equipment. So this is actually based off an equipment list that I've produced before. And you can see a few other little bits in there. Now, as you see, link to item, file name with extension. These are all things that are in there. We've got identified whether it's a folder or not. And then we get into Dataverse. Now, one thing I want to show about the Dataverse bit that can make the fact that content is hidden quite clear is you see here under the bits that say OData, we only have OData ID. There is a very specific type of hidden content I'm going to show a bit later called odata.editLink, which is really, really useful, that actually isn't present in that dynamic content menu. So we can look through that. We can see what we have available to us. You can obviously see based upon the manual trigger what's in there as well. Because looking at this, while I've talked about the fact that the raw outputs of an action show us certain things that are present in dynamic content menu, that's also the same for the trigger of a flow. The actual trigger of a flow will output more than is available to you in the trigger. So what we're going to do is we're going to just quickly pop test entry in here. I'm going to hit save, and we're going to run this flow, and we're going to see what we get out in terms of each of these actions.
You tabbed over to the other
Oh,
layout.
I missed things. Thank you very much for that, Jace. Miss key press. So, manually edit, hit test. Obviously, as you can tell, I've really named this flow quite well. Um, I always nag about naming convention. I should probably follow it myself. When we look at this, it should move through pretty quickly. We've triggered our flow. There we go. So we're starting to get our content back, right? Now, if I click into this action here and I hit show raw outputs, you can see on the right hand side we've got OData context, we've got a load of other bits, but then we get down to the actual value of the items. Now you remember I said about the Dataverse action just has OData ID, which is just this bit here, right? Well, actually, it's also got OData eTag and OData edit link. Now, this is content in here that you can access that you wouldn't be able to access if you were only using the dynamic content menu. So you can see here we've got a supplies ID, we've got things like the modified by, we've got the values for that. We've got kind of navigation links for and association links for things that it's related to. We've got quite a lot in here that we can kind of see. We can see we've got status code and other bits as well. So this is all basically JSON formatted. Um, so this is essentially just a bunch of JSON that we can look at, and oh great, well it's given us an OData edit link as an output here. Normally these outputs should be listed in the dynamic content menu, but not all of them are. So we're seeing that we're getting more than what we're seeing in that dynamic content. And as you can see under get items hidden SharePoint content, uh, this action works slightly differently. We can't actually show the raw outputs. You have to hit click to download, and then you get this nice, lovely, big block of stuff here. If I turn this into pretty print, you'll see it's structured exactly the same. We have body and then value, and we have a list of things like the title, the field in terms of field 1. That's saying that it's a SharePoint list expanded connection reference. That's a lookup column. All right, well, we've got the value of the lookup column. We've got the editor's name, email, claims, all of that, and available there to us. The department, their job title, if that's set up in Azure AD, that's content that we wouldn't normally see inside of the dynamic content menu that maybe would be useful for us to have. And you can see here I've got a start and wait for approvals. I'm just going to have to quickly make sure I actually approve that, so bear with me, so that we can get the dynamic content of that. Where's Teams gone? There you are. Now we're going to hope that it's come through. There we are, activity. So you can see here I've got a nice approvals request. I can put my comments in. I can put cancel request or follow up reassign. So I'm just going to hit approve on that. And I'm going to skip back over to here, and you can see start and wait for approval. Now, obviously, if you've used the approvals connector, you'll know kind of what the content is in there. But you can see here under body, we've got the request date, the response date, the approver's response, the comments, the response summary, which basically just gives you kind of a single line around who the approver was, what their email was, kind of what they did, whether they approved it, what the request date was. Essentially, a single line summary of that approval. That's not something that would normally be available to you inside of the dynamic content menu. We've got things like the request date and when that was supposed to expired, and things like the priority. Again, priority on an approval might be really important later down in your flow, but right now we have no way of kind of accessing it, right? So this is all well and good. If we look back at kind of our our slide here, we've seen that when we look at the raw outputs of an action, this is where we see where all that hidden content is. So great. We now know that there's more content than is available to us in the dynamic content space. We also know that the dynamic content menu doesn't provide us everything that we should have. Okay. Now, when we look at that, what we then need to know is how do we actually access it? And this is the big thing, right? How do we actually access the content that this is throwing to us? Well, the first thing is we need to know how to essentially navigate a JSON tree and get the outputs of a specific action. Now that's relatively easy to do. So there's a reason I have, coming back over to the flow, this compose action down here. If I were to put in something like the outcome of this approval here, and I hover over it, you'll see that it's actually based upon an expression. Every single one of our bits of dynamic content are essentially just a pre-programmed expression. Now we can use this to identify what we might want to do. Okay, now there's a few ways that we refer to our dynamic content. If it is a single item, such as when we've not got something in apply to each, it's relatively easy to do. You can see it says outputs there. Well, actually, for this bit of compose, I want to come to expressions, and I'm going to put outputs. Now, if I just quickly duplicate this tab, and we go back to the run history, we can see 5 minutes ago that run history ran. We can go, let's say we want to get a bit of dynamic content from the approvals piece. Okay, I'm just going to quickly turn off the new editor. Click in. So if we were to get, say, we wanted something from the body, okay, let's say I want to get the priority, okay. Well, you see here, we've got body responses. What we're going to do is we're going to read down essentially the JSON tree. So because obviously every action, its outputs is JSON. So we're going to come into the flow here. We know that the outputs takes, if it'll let me do it, hopefully. It takes an action name, right? And that is a string. Now that refers to this action that we want to target. It has to be in single quotations. So our apostrophe's in there. And where we've got spaces, you have to put in an underscore. So we just put that in. So this is one of the negatives of having long names, as we're about to see. I'm going to have to type this all out. Right, so now we've said, hey, we're targeting the outputs of that action. Okay. Now, obviously, when we look at the flow run history, these are our outputs, right? Show raw outputs there. Okay, perfect. We've got our outputs. We're targeting this. What do we need to get? Well, this is where the next step comes in. If we're targeting our outputs, we have to put in a open square bracket and apostrophe. What you'll commonly see when you look at others doing this, you will see a little question mark here, okay, or no question mark. Now that question mark does have an impact, all right? That question mark does what is known as optional chaining. Now, very simply what optional chaining is basically turning around and telling the system, hey, look for this bit of content inside the outputs of this. If the question mark's there, if it's empty, don't worry about it. Just leave yourself blank. If we remove the question mark, we're telling it, no, we're expecting that content to be there. It has to be there. If it isn't there, this compose action will then fail. Does that make sense? Hopefully so. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to put that little question mark in there because that's what I'm used to do. And I said I wanted to target the body and the responses, and then I wanted to get the priority, right? Now, the responses piece here is actually an array, okay? It's sat here, it's covering this. Now, you would think, obviously, because it's in line, we actually need to go body, then responses, then priority. But in this case, because the priority is on the same line as responses, we just need body priority. Now, if we were writing that, we go body / priority. Okay? So, I've just manually defined that as dynamic content. Okay? Now, if I hit save, and then we test with that previously used trigger, or not, because Microsoft disabled that recently, and I haven't re-enabled it using using PowerShell. So we'll run it again. So we can see that ran successfully. Now, if I look in Compose, even though I didn't select that content from the dynamic content menu, we can see that it turned up in that Compose box. So right here, show raw output, there's a priority. So all I did was I read the tree. I looked at body and I went, okay, I need to target the body section because my priority is inside that body section. I then went, okay, not a problem. It's the outputs of that action. It's then the body and the priority. That's what I need. And it is as simple as that for anything that is a single output. Now, what if we're not dealing with a single output? What if we're dealing with trying to loop through an array of things in an apply to each and then target dynamic content from an array of things? Well, it's relatively simple. We have our apply to each action, and we select what our outputs are. And for the case of this, I'm going to go for the value of the SharePoint stuff. I'm going to hit add an action, and I'm writing compose. Now, the process is the same in terms of the writing the expression and reading the tree. The function that you use to get that is different. We don't use outputs in this case because we're in an apply to each. We actually use items. So we use the item function, and you'll see there it says loop name. Now this refers to the apply to each loop that we're currently targeting. And then very simply, question mark, open square bracket, apostrophe, and Jace, out of interest, is there anything you can think of in the dynamic content for the SharePoint site that you want to target?
For a loop?
Yeah.
That's a very good question.
Do you
It
think
should
maybe
be
we should?
something that would change. No, I'm running a little bit of a blank here, I must admit.
Okay, not a problem. Do we think maybe we should go for the picture? Because that'll change for each account, or it should do, depending on the author. The author might all be me. Or do we go for the link to the item?
I mean, something item related might be perfect for this, right?
Yeah. Let's go for link to item then, so we can see that printed out in each of the composers there. Right? So we look at our logic tree. Right here we've got body, then value. Okay, that's not a problem. And then we come down into the item itself and the picture of the editor. So we need to go editor and then picture. So looking at that, we're looking body, then value, then down to editor, then into picture. Nice and easy. Body, / value, / editor, / picture. So you'll see me putting forward slashes in these. This is basically saying, hey, optional chain to find this specific item. You can also structure them slightly differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull that back to body, and then I'm going to go, let's say, question mark, and then go value, and then again, it was editor, and then picture. I'm going to drop that in there. And this would work exactly the same with a list rows kind of piece. So when we're looking at Dataverse, that would work as well. Save and test on that. In a few moments, I will remove the start and wait for approvals action so we don't have to keep approving it. Right, and you can see it's iterating through. It's doing what it should do. There's 30 items in there. It's run successfully. So now, obviously, you can see the slight difference in terms of structure. But if I look at, let's say, item 4, so something's gone wrong. I click to download. That's empty. Now, the reason that's empty is because I mentioned about the different structure, how I put the question marks in at each stage. That expression that I've written was slightly wrong. It didn't find the thing that I tried to target it. And so with that question mark and that optional chaining in there, what we're seeing is this doing what it should be doing. Instead of failing the action, like if I'd put the forward slashes in, it's gone, hey, you've asked for optional chaining. It's not there. I'm just going to say I succeeded and move on and leave myself blank. Yeah? A really useful thing to do in terms of optional chaining. Makes things a lot easier. Now, if we were actually targeting that, let's have a look. We've got value / and then we move down into editor. It's got a capital E. So here's where we get into the fact that defining your manual content, your manual dynamic content, capitalization matters, okay? If you get the capitalization wrong, it's probably going to fail. Now, when we do this, your best option is to take from the actual JSON outputs and then put it in there. So again, when we go into picture, pull this out, we update that, and for now, I'm going to remove this. So anybody notice what's just happened is that I've got a little red error up here. This is one thing. With normal dynamic content, if you delete the action that where you're using dynamic content later in the flow, it'll delete all the references to that step. Okay? In that situation, okay, if you're using manually defined dynamic content, it will not do that. So you need to be aware of that. Now, our compose action here has a manually defined action and dynamic content. We need to remove that dynamic content ourselves. Now, I'm just going to delete the action, but obviously it's something to be aware of, that if you don't do that, you're going to get flow errors. You're not going to be able to save your flow. That being said, let's give this another test and see the fact that our picture URL should turn up. Flow runs these submissions every time. Clearly, I haven't defined my dynamic content correctly because it's not pulling anything. Handy. Let's try that. It is very really broken. It's deciding not to do what it should be doing. So this is the joys of the manually defined dynamic content, right? Trying to access that hidden content. You are going to be doing some error handling. One thing I always say to people is, if you're not getting what you think you should be getting, take away the optional chaining. There we go. So what we found here is, because I was targeting body and value, but we were already in an apply to each loop, I didn't need to target body and value. Yeah, we can just put in editor picture, and then we get what we need. When we look at this, this is part of that piece, right? So when we're using items as an option in our manually defined dynamic content, when we're looking here, you don't have to navigate down through the body here or the value, because, and here's the fun bit, if I look at this, this item has already got body forward slash value in. So the apply to each already technically does the work of navigating down to the values list in an array for you. When we're manually defining that dynamic content, all you've got to do is, if you're in an apply to each loop, remember that you don't have to do this. You just have to look at these bits here and navigate down the tree there. Now, I've now shown essentially how you access it. Um, there are a few other little functions in there, such as the item function that's used specifically in things like filter arrays, but they're a bit more complex. But when we look at kind of how do we access it, it's relatively simple. We use expressions. We look at the JSON tree. If we're using an action that is outputting a single item, just an object and not an array, we're going to use the outputs action. We're going to use that outputs function. We're going to look down the tree, and we're probably going to go outputs body forward slash, and then whatever our dynamic content is, however deep it is, we navigate through that. When we're dealing with an action that outputs an array of items, such as a list rows function or a get items function from either Dataverse or SharePoint, or things that pull in SQL arrays, or things like that, right? We're going to be normally putting them in an apply to each, or we're going to use them in a filter array. We use the items or item function, and then again, we look at that JSON tree and we go, okay, right, where's my bit? Go down the tree, find out where it is, and follow the path to it, right? This is really, really useful. It means that we can really get to the core of some of the stuff that Power Automate gives us and make things really, really helpful. The other thing it's really good at is if you have API calls, so I'm doing a lot of work with SharePoint REST API at the moment. If you have a lot of API calls that output a JSON body output, or you define your REST API to do JSON body output, you then don't potentially have to do a parse JSON step. You can decide to just take that JSON body and from the outputs and manually reference it, meaning that you have one less action in your flow, which means your flow runs that little bit quicker, which means you've got a performance improvement. Really, really useful, really powerful. But we've looked at some of the hidden content, right? I've put this in terms of showing the hidden content that's out there for one massive reason. There is some hidden content within Dataverse actions that is massively powerful. And the one I want to show is essentially the OData edit link that I showed before. So when we looked at the run history on the Dataverse action, one of the options that wasn't available to us in the dynamic content menu was this OData edit link. Now, a lot of the time when we're using Dataverse tables, we're building relational databases, right? And another large amount of the time spent in Power Automate when working with Dataverse is creating new records and then linking them to another record or the parent record, right? And before the OData kind of edit link piece was there, if we wanted to add a new record, let's say for every row that I had in my suppliers one, I'm just going to change this one out. And we're going to put the value from the Dataverse one. Let's say for every supplier that I have in here, I wanted to add a new row to my assets table. Okay, add new row here. And I wanted to relate that new asset back to the supplier. So I'm just going to say PAGC assets. So this is obviously a throwback to an old solution in terms of the assets table. So I'm just going to quickly show that in terms of where that sits. PAGC, Power Apps Grid Control. So this was based upon the Power Apps Grid Control before, but if we look at this one, the model-driven app, in this solution, we essentially have two tables. We have suppliers and assets, right? Now, the suppliers table has a load of child records in the assets table. You can see here, PAGC assets 1 is from PAGC suppliers 2, so on and so forth, right? And that's all well and good, adding them manually through here. But let's say for the sake of this, anytime I wanted to go through and list all of my suppliers, and for each supplier, I wanted to add a new asset. Well, what am I going to do? I'm going to call it asset, let's say asset, let's have a look. Let's pick one of the dynamic contents here. Asset OData ID, right? That's all well and good. We can access the OData ID because we're going to apply to each. Now, if we hover over that, you can see items apply to each, add OData ID. If I hit show advanced options, well, what used to happen before if we wanted to assign a supplier is you had to put / and then we'd have to go and find the suppliers table itself and the name of it. So bear with me one moment. So we go to our tables, we find the suppliers table here, and you can see there it's got its name as PNI PAGC suppliers. So I'm just going to hit edit on that. So I'm just going to open that up, go to properties. We'd have to then copy the logical name of the table and drop that in, and then we'd have to put open bracket, and then, okay, we need the GUID, which is, let's say, the OData ID, or is it PAGC suppliers, unique identifier for any instances. So we have to manually write that out, right? Now, if we were to look at the flow run history for the previous runs of the flow that we're working on, what we'll end up seeing is that that is actually already available, not within the dynamic content menu, but it's already present inside that OData edit link. You see, PNI, PAGC suppliers, and then the GUID of the record. So before we had to manually define that. Now we can just go to expression, items, apply to each. And this is where having the run history here is helpful because we just take this, copy that, paste that in there, hit OK. Now that's much more reliable than if you manually define it for one reason. So we've seen it once where the old way of defining those relationships used to be forward slash the logical name of the table forward slash the GUID. And then it moved to forward slash the logical name of the table open brackets the GUID close bracket. When that change occurred, because the person had manually defined it rather than using the OData edit link reference from before, essentially it broke. So using that auto edit link means that that keeps up with the changes to the requirements, makes it a lot more safe, and also makes it easier for us to kind of to target that. So if I test that and we run it through, what we end up seeing if I come over to my assets table as this is running is we're starting to see items be created with the OData ID in there as the name, but PAG-C supplies, you see there, supplier 1, PAG-C suppliers 4, suppliers 2, suppliers 3, suppliers 5, suppliers. So they're actually being added as we go through. For each of our suppliers, we've just added a row that is linked to that supplier just based upon that dynamic content there. So this one here, there you go. You can see when we go show row inputs, PAG-C suppliers, that's our data edit link. So very quickly, we can use that to find parent records and then immediately tie the child record to that parent record just by using something that's already there. It's really useful, really helpful, very powerful as well in terms of obviously making that a bit easier. But that's not the only bit of dynamic content that's out there. SharePoint, the reason why I've shown the SharePoint one is because SharePoint hides a lot of its content in here. So you could see things like the author's picture. So let's say you wanted to send an email to someone in terms of, you've got a bit of a approvals on an item, and you want to send the person who created that item's picture to the person who's going to approve it as part of the approvals. You can do that by targeting this picture URL and putting it in the email. It works. You can filter people out by department and job title. This kind of content that's available there is not something that is available in that dynamic content menu and can actually really help. The other thing that is very useful as well is that if you use a lookup column anywhere in here, you can actually access the contents of that record that you're looking up to in SharePoint from this tree, which you wouldn't normally be able to do without a parse JSON step in the dynamic content menu, and that aspect things again makes things really, really easy. You've also got kind of things like the full path, the link to the item, the file name with its extension, and its actual version number as well. So you can tell what version it's currently sat at and some of the version history that's there as well. So if you wanted to do a check for anything that only has minor versions, you can use that version number to filter that down, but it's not available in the dynamic content menu. We can kind of pick that up as well. We obviously are looking at what hidden content is out there. There is loads. Pretty much every action that you use in Power Automate will have some level of hidden content. So I mentioned obviously about the outputs that come with the triggers. So if I look at this, we've got a load of headers here. You can actually access these headers and find out a fair few things. So for instance, for manually triggered flows, you can find out who triggered the flow. You can find out the user's email via decoding it. You can even find out the original kind of workflow URL, which is this bit here, and a few other bits as well. The other side as well is if you look at some of the content that's kind of done when we look at the show raw inputs, you can actually occasionally target the inputs as well, but not using the output section, using the rest. If I look at, for instance, what list, what do I have? I have my list copy and paste up. Let's have a look at that. That has some interesting actions in it. So you can see here, I've got a list paste app. This is part of an old solution I've built. Obviously, as you can see, we've got a few failed flow runs there, but we're going to go for the succeeded one. This is this is an old solution I built. But in here, if I go to when Power Apps calls a flow, Obviously, that's quite a commonly used trigger because a lot of time we have flows that are triggered from Power Apps. If I hit show raw outputs in here, I can target these two. I can also target things like the XMS username or other bits as well. Now, coming into this actual flow, I also have a send HTTP request to SharePoint here, and you can see as the outputs, I have a body execute template scripts, and I have the results section here. This outcome number, actually, when it comes to SharePoint HTTP requests, a lot of the time they'll return telling you, hey, this action succeeded, when actually it didn't. This outcome number is actually mapped to something, and it's something you can't access in dynamic content. But what you can do is you can access it using the expressions that we've shown today, and you can test it in a condition. So if it's 2, it means it's succeeded. If it's 3, my understanding is it's failed, or 1 is failed, or 4 is too many requests. So you can actually test that and then build in a bit better error handling to your flows. It's really useful to know that that's there, especially with SharePoint HTTP requests. The SharePoint actions that are available to us as standard are actually relatively limited compared to what the SharePoint REST API allows us to do. But useful to know that's there. So, with all that being said, we now know what some of what the hidden content there is. We know what it hides and how it hides it. So we know where to find it, which means we go into that show raw outputs. We know how to write our expressions to access it, and actually also how to make those expressions a bit more robust in terms of checking whether the content is there or not using optional chaining, or if we want to force it to fail using those forward slashes. So in summary, that capability to be able to look at that JSON output of an actual step that you are using, an action you're using, and then be able to manually define the route to that content that's hidden in there is really, really useful, really, really powerful. And I would implore anybody who's working with Power Automate to really, as you start to do test runs, start to look at the raw outputs of your actions and see what's there, and really kind of make use of that powerful kind of expression usage, because it becomes second nature if you do it well enough. But I hope you found the session useful. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.